World War II put together. It was just a fantastic achievement, producing a B-24 finally won an hour at Willow Run. But World War I was somewhat even more impressive because we started with essentially no army and no artillery, of course we had no airplanes, we had no tanks, which were, by 1916, were a new revolutionary weapon. And when we declared war on this Central Powers, April of 1917, we had no military. Fast forward a year later, we were only in the war a year and a half, we had sent over 1 million men to Europe. And by the end of the war, we had mobilized over 2 million people. And because we came in late, and we had the fewest casualties of the Allied powers, and we were the most decisive, we sort of felt that we had won the war, even though by any measure of fairness, the sacrifices of France and Britain had been much more considerable. But then we had this Versailles Treaty, which we felt, remember this was not called World War I, that term did not originate. It was sporadic in the late 30s, but it didn't become institutionalized until the beginning of World War II. It was the Great War, and the war to end all wars. And that was because of this enormous mobilization and bringing over 1 million people without losing a single soldier in 1918, we had enormous prestige. And Woodrow Wilson, we make fun of him today, but if you look at the exact text of the 14-point speech that he gave as sort of a preliminary outline of what he wanted to see enacted at Versailles, it's not that radical. It's more or less that there's going to be freedom of the use of the seas, national boundaries will be adjudicated in transparent fashion, there will be a League of Nations, a little bit utopian, but it wasn't that radical. We also think that in this peace treaty, the Big Four, Mr. Orlando from Italy didn't play that much of a part. It was basically David Lloyd George of Britain, Clemenceau of France, and Wilson were punitive. In other words, they had a Carthaginian peace, as John Maynard Keynes said. If you remember his best-selling book, The Economic Consequences of the Peace, which was very influential. And the idea was that Germany had been punished under the Versailles Treaty, and that idea came from, it's a massive document, 400 pages, but there were certain things in it that we focused on. One of them, of course, was Germany would not be allowed to have an army over 100,000 people in it, soldiers. It would not have a general staff. It could not have an armored force. It could not have an air force. It had to give up its Pacific and African, small as they were, colonies. It had to give back the Alsace-Lorraine. It had to negate the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk that it imposed on the Soviet Union. It had reparations to pay, and on and on. This was considered very punitive. But if you, like the 14 points, if you actually look at the terms of the Versailles Treaty, it's very hard to see how that was punitive in two different ways. Remember that asking the Alsace-Lorraine back it had been taken from France in the Prussian War of 1871. So basically Germany had it and they wanted more. It wasn't, World War I wasn't fought to take the Alsace, it was to take 50–60% of France. And if you look at culpability for the war, I mean, France did not invade Germany, Britain did not invade Germany, United States did not invade Germany. Germany invaded on both fronts. And so to say that they were culpable seems to make some sense. Now, reparations are a very controversial subject because people who were for them say that they wouldn't have destroyed the German economy had the Germans not stopped paying, deliberately inflated their currency to pay in cheaper marks. And then there's who say, well, the problem with reparations were that the United States was lending Germany money so Germany could pay reparations to Britain so Britain could pay the United States back its war debt, which was true. But that's a different issue about whether it would have worked or not. Germany had a series of government-sponsored strikes that deliberately slowed down the economy and a deliberate policy of inflation. My point is that if you look what Wilson said and what the Allies imposed on Germany, it was not that far-fetched, but there was a problem. I'll get to that in a minute. But before I do, one of the ways we can adjudicate the Versailles Treaty is to look at other treaties in that same era involving World War I and later that Germany had imposed on others. So when Germany invaded in August of 1914, 1914, and it looked like there would be no miracle at the Marne, and it was going to take France. They had a so-called September program, Professor Reisling, who later ended up at Columbia University in the United States. And you should read that document. That would be the peace that Germany thought it would impose on France and Belgium by December 1914. There wasn't going to be an independent Belgium. It would cease to exist. It would be a protectorate of Germany, and Germany needed, it said, Atlantic ports, so all of the French ports were going to be German-controlled, and there was going to be a permanent annexation of about 40 or 50 miles beyond the Alsace-Lorraine, and France was going to be disarmed in a way that Germany, nobody had ever imagined, even Germany would be after the war, the victors. If we look at the treaty compared to what Germany imposed on Russia when it was defeated in late 1917 at the Brest-Litovsk, in March of 1918 it was finalized, you should read that treaty. Germany in World War I under Versailles lost 20,000 square miles. It took away from the newly Soviet Union, it took away 1 million square miles. It lost 5 to 8% of its industrial capacity under the Versailles Treaty. It took from Russia about 40% of its industrial capacity. It lost about 5 to 7 million German speakers that were now outside the orbit of Germany, and 65 million Russian speakers or Ukrainian speakers, or let's say non-German speakers, were now to be incorporated in the German Reich. So by any contemporary standard, Versailles was pretty light. If you compare it to what happened after World War II, Germany was not occupied except for portions of the Rhineland. There was a protectorate with an election in the Saar. It was very mild into what the Allies imposed on Germany after World War II. That being said, and here's where we get to, I think, some of the lessons of World War I, if the Versailles Treaty was not necessarily punitive or Carthaginian in comparison with what followed or what Germany itself would have done to other people, then why did we have World War II? Because after all, the standard exegesis is that a crippled Germany, unduly blamed for something that was beyond its own control, was forced into poverty, and then the conditions were so desperate that somebody like Hitler came to power and was able to sort of hijack German democracy, and by 1933 we were on the road to World War II. That is all true, but it doesn't deal with the main point. The Versailles Treaty would have worked had it been enforced, and the problem with the Versailles Treaty is it was humiliating, yes. Nothing's worse than be humiliating, but it was also weak. There were no methods of enforcement. The United States had a great debate about the League of Nations, but the idea that a country would surrender its right to make war didn't make sense to people in the United States, both Republican and Democrat. We never ratified that, but that was a formal idea that there was going to be a group of prominent, preeminent nations that would enforce the elements of the Versailles Treaty. When we backed out of that and everybody went home, there was only one country, the one in greatest jeopardy, France, that was in charge of enforcing the elements of the Versailles Treaty. Britain quickly said that Britain had the luxury of doing that because, after all, it was a sea power and it had the English Channel, but it basically backed out of enforcement, and France was in the difficult position. It had a smaller population, smaller territory, even than a weakened Germany, of trying to enforce reparations, trying to enforce demilitarization of the Rhineland, and at one time it went in and took over the coal mines. It tried to forcibly extract resources from Germany, but it was in a difficult position. And so what happened with Versailles was that the Allies pontificated, they lectured, they sermonized about Germany is going to do this, Germany is going to do this, and then almost immediately they had a crisis of confidence. They had been too mean, the Depression took over, reparations were considered the problem, and they did not enforce the statutes. And they created the worst of a diplomatic scenario as you could imagine. That is to talk tough, to talk loudly, and to have a small stick. They talked just loudly enough to humiliate Germany, but not loudly enough or with not enough force behind it to ensure that they were defeated and they were humiliated, and they understood that in the way that they did in World War II. Now, I'd like to just briefly, before we get to the American lessons of World War I, just go through the 4 or 5 belligerents and see how this affected them. For France, after World War I, there were some certain messages. One is that they could not defeat Germany by themselves. They had to have a British army on the continent, and they had to have the entrance of America. And so in their way of thinking, those were both wild cards that may not happen again. And it was very tragic because the winners of World War I got the wrong lessons and the losers got the right ones. The right lessons were that a static warfare would be inconsequential and that it would be costly and that you had to have some type of mobility. The Germans were experimenting with tanks and mobile artillery at a much faster rate, and yet Germany only produced 8 tanks in World War I. France produced over 5,000. France was the premier armor power of World War I. And when the war ended, the problem wasn't that they invested 1 or 2% of their gross national product in the Maginot Line. The Maginot Line would have worked had it been used in concert with a sophisticated mobile artillery and armor force, and it wasn't. And this was extremely catastrophic because as far as technology goes, France military technology was superior to Germany all the way up till 1939. The French Char tank was 5 times better than the Mark I, Mark II, and Mark III German tank. German artillery was almost as good as the French artillery as the German 88. When Germany invaded France in May of 1940, France had superior and more numerous tanks. They had a greater army, and in theory, they could have won. But the problem was that they were terrified from World War I, that their allies were not committed to a collective defense, and they had thought that somehow they had paid too much of a price and they were not going to get in that situation again. And so they began not to worry about the systematic violations of the Versailles Treaty, whether it was the rearmament of the German Wehrmacht, or it was the occupation of the Rhineland, or it was the perversion of the Saarland, and they felt that they would be on their own, and they adapted basically a policy of appeasement. So much so that by 1930-29, people could not reference Verdun. They shall not pass, the great slogan at Verdun, that was considered taboo, warlike, belligerent, aggressive pose, and French school people were learning that Verdun was basically the ossuary at Verdun. It was not a heroic moment where French civilization had stopped Prussian aggression. So that was one of the lessons that was going to lead to World War II, that no matter how spectacular your resistance to Germany had been, no matter how sophisticated French technology was in World War I and in between the wars, it was a psychological crisis that France underwent, that they thought that they could never resist Germany unless they had allies that would join them on the continent, and that was not going to happen again, and they would have to make the necessary adjustments. If you look at Britain, France lost more men than any of the allies, of 1.7 to 2.1, depending on whose figures you use, but Britain lost second, over 1 million, probably 1.2 million. In the British mind, this had been a catastrophic disaster because it went against every element of British strategy. All the way back to the Napoleonic Wars, the idea was Britain does not get into a continental war with either France, but especially Germany. It had the most sophisticated appraisal of the Prussian General Staff. It understood that you could not win a land war against Germany. The way you defeated an army was to nibble at their periphery, use sea power, blockade. It did that in World War I, but unfortunately it had, because of the dire circumstances by 1915, it poured men and materiel into the continent. After World War I was over, in the British mindset, we are not going to get engaged, and we're not going to have another Somme, and we're not going to be in league with the French because we will end up in another land war. This was so pervasive that it not only encouraged an ideology of appeasement, but even in World War II, the so-called Second Front controversy between the Americans and the British, Churchill, he said in his memoirs that he had nightmares of Passchendaele and the Somme. And so even in World War II, there was always a soft underbelly going into the Balkans, going into Italy, going into Rhodes of all places, North Africa. But you did not want to do what the Americans had demanded, land on the continent and go straight into the heart of Germany, because if you did, you'd end up in a war of attrition against this superb army. That was a lesson, basically, that the British learned, and it was very deleterious, because at each stroke of Hitler's aggrandizement, whether it was into the Rhineland or the Saar or the Anschluss or Czechoslovakia, the British, behind their appeasement, was always, we cannot afford to get into a land war on the continent, because it will inevitably result in something analogous to our sacrifice in World War I. Germany had a very different reaction to World War I. There were a few voices, not many, who understood that the Versailles Treaty was not necessarily that punitive, especially given that they understood what they had imposed on Russia and what they would have imposed on the Allies. So they understood that, but it was politically toxic to say that. And out of this idea was that Germany felt that if they were to recapture territory, east and west, if they were to recapture glory and influence, they would have to have a type of warfare that was not a war of attrition on either two fronts. And out of this, they learned some valuable but ultimately catastrophic lessons. The first was they felt that they could create a new type of warfare. We call it blitzkrieg. They never used that term, but sharp armor thrust supported by close air support with independent operating armor divisions would, almost like Alexander the Great at the Battle of Gaugamela, punch through a hole, get to the rear of the enemy, cause a catastrophic collapse in enemy morale, and win the war outright without having to have a sort of a Verdun. And they were so confident, they'd seen a little bit of it in the Spanish Civil War, that when they went into Poland, when they divided up with the Soviet Union in it was absolutely impressive. They went in, as you know, into Denmark in one day. And in the spring, they overran Holland, Belgium, and France in less than 30 days. And everybody said blitzkrieg is the way of the future. But notice, there were a few voices, even Guderian, who was one of the architects, that said, this is not a serious way of looking at war. This is an anecdote to World War I, but there is no substitute for men on the ground, a sophisticated industrial base, materiel, and widespread conscription. The German economy was not mobilized to the degree that Britain was. Think of this for a minute. Germany had almost double the potential industrial output of Britain, and in World War II, Britain produced more tanks and more planes than Germany alone. The United States produced 6 times more than Germany, but Britain alone, even during the Blitz, while Britain was being attacked, it produced more Spitfires than Germany did on attack, basically, with 109 fighters. They never really mobilized because they were convinced that the way to win the war, unlike World War I, was quick lightning spread. And what was the real lesson? Blitzkrieg was a brilliant way of fighting a border war against a European neighbor that had sophisticated roads and did not require a lot of logistical capability. So if Poland's next to Germany, France is next to Germany, you have the road system is integrated, you can collapse these Western democracies who are not, they're not authoritarian, they're, as Hitler said, I've seen them at Munich, they're worms, et cetera, et cetera. However, the first time Blitzkrieg was asked to engage with a real enemy, Britain, which required sophisticated air support independent of close air support of tanks or an amphibious capability or a surface fleet, it was absolutely unable to do anything against Britain. It lost the Battle of Britain within 5 months. Catastrophic losses, over 2,000 airframes, which would really hurt it in the Soviet Union. So then, not learning that lesson, Hitler thought, well, we really didn't try Blitzkrieg because we couldn't. He didn't envision that when you wage war, you have to have multifaceted assets. And if England is on an island, just because you can't get to it really matters. You can't get to it. So what good is Blitzkrieg if you can't get there? So when they went into the Soviet Union in June 1941, they were warned that the Soviet Union, unlike France, does not have a good road system. They warned that the German economy was still not on a war footing. They warned them that not only did the Soviet Union have 5 times as many artillery platforms and tanks, but they already had about 400 T-34s that were better than anything, and that the Mark I, Mark II, Mark III tanks were all obsolete, and even their new Mark IV was obsolete in comparison to the latest Russian. And Blitzkrieg essentially died within 4 months on the suburbs of Moscow. A little bit in 1942, but after that, especially its epitaph was at Kursk, the Battle of Kursk. So the lesson that Germany got from World War I is not that you don't fight a two-front war necessarily, not that they had fought pretty well and you mobilize your entire economy, you have large